Today on the Root Cause Medicine podcast.
We need to really wake up to this, that yes, nearly 1 in 2 kids have a chronic health diagnosis, but so many more have chronic health concerns that maybe aren't on the level of getting a diagnosis, but their skin isn't buttery soft and they have eczema patches here and there, or they're wiggling and they just can't be comfortable in their own body, or they have anxiety that's really impacting their lives, but not enough to go see the doctor just yet. And there's so many more things that our kids are facing nowadays.
Well, hello there. I'm your host for today, Dr. Kate Kresge, and we have an awesome interview about integrative pediatrics for you today. We're talking with the wonderful Dr. Elisa Song. She's been an integrative pediatric practitioner for 20 years, and she's written the book, Healthy Kids, Happy Kids, an integrative pediatrician's guide to whole child resilience. Why your child's microbiome holds the key to lifelong wellness. This is going to be a phenomenal conversation, and this book is incredible. So let me start by saying, if you don't have the book, you should absolutely go get it. It's every parent's guidebook that they've wished they've had in the middle of the night or when things are going wrong, to all of their options for managing common childhood symptoms naturally. Dr. Song covers everything from gut issues to eczema to asthma. She goes through common illnesses and how to treat them naturally at home. I think the most impactful part of this interview for me was when Dr. Song said she's only prescribed antibiotics a handful of times in the last 10 years in her practice. That is very full of kids. So we're going to dive into this, and we're going to start with part 1. In part 1, we're going to talk about why Dr. Elisa chose to dedicate half of her book to the microbiome and to gut health. In the second part, we're going to go over the practical, tactical strategies that she uses for common everyday illnesses. Before we get started, though, I want to talk to you about something that comes up pretty often on this podcast. And that, of course, is lab testing. You see, testing is one essential way to understand the root cause of an illness. If you're an integrative or functional medicine practitioner, chances are you're placing a ton of orders with a ton of different labs. The Root Cause Medicine podcast is created by Rupa Health. Rupa is the best way to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different labs in one single place for free. Thank goodness. No need to create and log into multiple portals ever again. If you're a practitioner, make sure you go sign up at rupahealth.com to create your free account today. Now, let's start the show. Dr. Elisa Song, welcome to the Root Cause Medicine podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
I'm so excited that you are here, but I'm also so grateful that you have written this book, Healthy Kids, Happy Kids, an Integrative Pediatrician's Guide to Whole Child Resilience. And I want to just give you some space for a minute to talk about why now for this book.
You know, it's something that I think many practitioners think about writing a book, and it kind of crosses your mind here and there, but it is such an undertaking, especially when you have kids at home and you have a full-time practice. So it took a while to get there, and I've been thinking about it for years. But honestly, through the pandemic, when there was just so much, I guess fear is the right word, right? So much unknown, so much of, oh my gosh, how do I keep my kids well? How do I help them thrive? Like, what is going on? And then there's a mental health emergency in our kids and our teens. And I just thought, you know what? This is the time to write it. This is the time where parents and really all of us are so attuned to the eyes opening to the fact that our kids aren't well, that they're not thriving. And honestly, adults aren't thriving, but we have the knowledge to be able to share and move forward with our kids' health. So that's really why I wrote the book. I wrote it for parents and for practitioners, and I wrote it for kids. I really wanted it to be something that kids too, at any age, could really look through. There's some super cute graphics. And I've had teens and tweens read and really be able to take away some of the messages. So I want everyone to really move forward with hope and the understanding that we can be empowered to really take charge of our health and our family's health.
It's so exciting and it's so important. I think one of the statistics that I heard you cite was nearly 1 in 2 kids in the US is diagnosed with a chronic disease right now. And that to me feels like a staggering statistic. And what are some of the diseases our kids are dealing with now that might even surprise a grandparent who maybe is used to their kids growing up, and when their kid was growing up, they had asthma and that was it? Like, what are some of the newer disorders our kids are dealing with?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you that number, that 40% number from the CDC, it's pretty outdated. And I'm going to say, I mean, it really not to be doom and gloom, but more to be like, we need to really wake up to this, that yes, nearly 1 in 2 kids have a chronic health diagnosis, but so many more have chronic health concerns that maybe aren't on the level of getting a diagnosis, but their skin isn't buttery soft and they have eczema patches here and there, or they're wiggling and they just can't be comfortable in their own body, or they have anxiety that's really impacting their lives, but not enough to go see the doctor just yet. And so there's so many more things that our kids are facing nowadays. And what would a grandparent be surprised about? I mean, I would say even a parent, because when I was in training, I mean, I finished my medical school in the late 90s and pediatric residency in 2000. And that was at UCSF. I mean, a center where we see the sickest of the sick kids. And when I finished my residency in 2000, there was no such thing as type 2 diabetes. Why? Because it was called adult onset diabetes, right? I mean, it was juvenile type 1 autoimmune, and then it was adult onset type 2, which is diet and lifestyle related. And kids were not getting type 2 diabetes, right? And so now you look at the numbers and it is shocking, probably 1 in 13 kids is metabolically unfit and heading towards prediabetes. Even the kids in my practice who are slim, who are athletic, who are working out every day, and they don't fit the picture of what we think of as diabetes. What else is worsening or is new? When I was in residency, there was no such diagnosis as sensory processing disorder. That didn't exist. And now there are so many kids who just can't stand different touch or sounds or textures to the extent that it's really impacting and debilitating their lives. And they are getting help for sensory processing disorder. We know that the rates of autism are skyrocketing. It's not just a matter of better diagnosis, and it's also the severity of illnesses too. I mean, sure, I had kids with eczema, but when I was in training, we didn't put anything stronger than hydrocortisone 1% on the face, and never, ever put steroids in the diaper area. And now it's stronger, stronger, stronger steroids, oral steroids, sometimes oral antibiotics. And even I've had some kids come to me who they've exhausted all the possibilities. Their steroids have been so strong, oral and topical, that they're in adrenal crisis. And so now they're heading to chemotherapy agents. So it's this march that really back in 2005, when I was starting, I opened my practice in 2004. The very next year, the New England Journal of Medicine came out with an article. It was a prediction based on statistical analysis where the researchers noted that for the past 1,000 years, our lifespan has been increasing. We've been getting healthier and healthier, modern diet and lifestyle, hygiene, medical advances. We've been living longer. Well, in 2005, it was predicted that for the first time ever in history, this trend was going to reverse, that our kids are expected to have shorter lifespans than us, their parents, now because of our modern diet and lifestyle. So I thought that would ring the alarm bells and wow, we're going to start to do something about it and change the food and change the way we're living. And it hasn't happened yet. I think there's more awareness, but I mean, this is why I wrote the book now, because it's been 9 years since that was here, nearly 10 years. We can't wait anymore.
Yeah. This is the manual. For those of you who can't see, I'm holding up this book. It truly is a manual that you should get now, keep forever. And I love that you wrote it so that kids can read it too, and teens, and also feel empowered. I'm in love with the way you laid this book out. And I want to talk about the fact that you seem to have done this intentionally, which is there's so much in the back that we could start with that's like, okay, let's talk about the top 8 conditions you should know how to deal with at home for your kids, and other conditions A to Z that I'm going to give you suggested remedies for. And it'd be so easy to flip to the back of the book when your kid has a fever and just find the homeopathy or essential oils or whatever acupressure point you're recommending. But you didn't lay your book out like that. Instead, the first half of the book is dedicated to the microbiome and the gut. So why did you do that?
Well, because I truly believe that if kids and parents and practitioners understand how powerful your child's developing microbiome is for their developing immune system, their developing brains, even their future epigenetic potentials, that framing how you support them, how we live and eat, how we manage their acute illnesses from a microbiome centric gut first approach, it makes everything else make sense. Everything else can fall into place. And so that is truly the foundation. Once we as families and as practitioners really understand how to help our kids harness the power of their microbiomes, they're set for life. I mean, that really and truly, I think if they really truly understand that, they are going to be thriving young adults, thriving parents, and they're going to be able to move this forward to our grandchildren and our great grandchildren.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's dive into what you mean. You have a couple terms that I love in this book. You talk about microbiome magic, microbiome champions. For somebody who's thinking, okay, what is a microbiome? Is a baby born with a microbiome? How do they get one? And why does this matter more now in 2024? Because of what else is going on in our society, then maybe it mattered, or maybe we had to think about it like 30 years ago.
Yeah. So many people, and obviously listeners to the RUPA podcast, the Root Cause podcast, will have heard of the microbiome. But when we think about the microbiome for our children, especially, it is still that ecosystem inside us. And that's where a lot of my patients mistakenly at first think that the microbiome is simply the microorganisms in your gut. So yeah, that makes up your microbiome, but your microbiome is that community of microorganisms, that ecosystem. It is the microbiota, the microscopic organisms, and the environment in which they're living, and also their genes, their literal genetic material that they bring with them to help keep us healthy and happy. And they are really the foundations of how we keep our child's immune system well. When 80% of their immune system lies in their gut, it is how we keep their brains and neurologic, cognitive, and emotional well-being intact, knowing that the vast majority of many of the neurotransmitters are made by our gut microbiome. So if we have a friendly composition of microbiota and this ecosystem is thriving, then that does really keep our kids thriving. And so the foundations of that stem really from creating microbiome magic with the 5 things that we already do every single day. I wanted to make this book really doable, practical, engaging, and fun for families and for kids. Because if it's not fun, you're not going to do it, right? You might do it for a little bit, but it doesn't last, right? And if it's not doable in a simple way, it's going to be one more thing that you add to the list that as a mom, you feel guilty about because you're not doing it, right? And as a kid, you feel annoyed about because there's another thing that mom is nagging you to do, right? And so the 5 things that create microbiome magic, they are things that we already do every single day. But if we learn how to do them like a gut hero, make these small shifts in how we're doing them, then we are by default then in just what we're doing, we are nourishing and optimizing our gut microbiome. So it's the 5 things are we have to eat every day, we have to breathe, we have to move, we have to hydrate, we have to sleep every day. But when we frame it in a way that, okay, here are some things in the evidence that we know if you do them in this way, it actually makes your microbiome happier and healthier. And guess what? They're actually not difficult to tweak. We just have to know the how.
Yeah. Let's dive into it. Let's start with the first pillar. Let's start with what to eat. This can be a hard one, right? And I love that you took special care in the book to talk about easy, quick things that parents could do where you're not having to cook from scratch necessarily every day. Let's talk about that first pillar. What do you mean when you say that? Eat for your, yeah.
Eat for your microbiome. So in part 2, I go through each of these 5 things in depth. Now, I devoted 2 separate chapters to nourish, right? Because for parents who do have pickier eaters and you're thinking, all right, I know to eat the rainbow, but I'm not getting my kids to do that just yet. How do we do that? How do we still nourish their microbiome? And I will say the reason why I have all of the 4 other things is because if you have kids who are super, super picky right now, and it's the most stressful thing to change their diet, then you can start with one of the other four things, right? You don't have to start with what they're eating. It all makes a difference. And so all of these five things I put together into a wheel of whole gut resilience, because a wheel doesn't have a start or an end. If thinking about changing your kid's diet is really causing undue amounts of stress right now for the whole family, but if they love to move, all right, well, then let's focus on movement to optimize our microbiome. And wherever you start, the wheel keeps moving forward. I mean, that's the whole point. And so, but with Nourish, because of course, food is one of the foundations and food is medicine, I broke that up into two sections. So the first is, what do you want to try to get in? What microbiome champions do we want to really mindfully get into our family's diet? Because by default, what we do for our kids, we do for ourselves. And that's going to help your microbiome too as an adult. The second part of it, though, is sometimes it's easier to think about, what do we keep out and what kind of swaps do we make? So when we think about what we get in, our three main microbiome champions, they're all plants. Okay, they're all plant-based. And I call them the three Fs to try to make it easier to remember. So fiber, phytonutrients, which is a pH, but it sounds like an F, so it's easier for kids to remember, and fermented foods. So they all serve a huge role in nurturing our microbiome. Now, why is that? Well, the fiber from plants, not just fruits and vegetables, but legumes and whole grains and nuts and seeds, that is the food for our probiotics, right? Those are the prebiotics. Phytonutrients, that's the color, all the different colors of the rainbow. And each color actually can serve a prebiotic function, interestingly. And also, our microbiome, our microbiota uses those phytonutrients to really create these amazing compounds for ourselves, and even to shift how our genes are turning on, turning off, and working for us or against us. And then fermented foods, I love, love, love. And I include recipes in the book because sometimes you need a little help to get your creative juices flowing. And a lot of people get stuck on the sauerkraut or the kimchi. I don't know. My kids aren't necessarily into that just yet, which is okay. My kids are not huge sauerkraut fans, but I have a fermented blackberry lemonade recipe in the book that is super easy. We want to think beyond the just really sour flavors and think about like a sweet but tangy fermented fruit juice, which you can do. And you can make those into popsicles or jello or put them into smoothies. So a lot of different ways. Now, a lot of people think fermented foods, that the main benefit is because of the probiotic content in there, which actually, yes, and that's part of it, but probably the least important part of the benefits of our microbiome of fermented foods, because fermented foods, some of them don't have a lot of probiotics in them. And sure, they have some prebiotics, but they are chock full of what are called postbiotics. Those are the beneficial byproducts, the fermentation products. When the probiotics come, eat the prebiotics, let's say the cabbage in the sauerkraut, then they spit out all of these amazing compounds like vitamin B12, like our neurotransmitters, GABA or serotonin, or even short chain fatty acids like butyrate, which is now considered one of the master regulators of health. So, that's like a little, it can seem like, oh my gosh, all of this food, how am I going to get that into my kids? So I have fun tips. Like one of the things that kids love when I talk about is, all right, we know these are plants. So how do we think about making every meal or snack pop? So POP. How do we think about making every meal or snack pop with plants on purpose? I mean, it's a small shift you can make. If your kids really love oatmeal for breakfast, okay, how about grinding up some pumpkin seeds into a fine powder and just mixing that into your oatmeal? That's another plant right there, right? Or phytonutrients, what I talk to the kids about is broccoli tends to be a favorite vegetable for a lot of kids. So if they're eating broccoli, all right, well, go to the farmer's market or go to the market, get some purple broccoli. That's same flavor, different color. That still counts as another point, another plant, because it's a different color. So anyhow, I've had toddlers go up to their parents when they hear me talk about this. And a mom called me, her daughter was like 3.5 or 4. And she said her daughter came up to her dinner and was like, are we going to make it pop? Which is, I mean, how cute is that, right? But it makes it memorable and makes it so that kids actually want to do it. It's not like, I don't want another vegetable. It's like, let's make it pop, right? Let's think of how we do that. Right. Yeah, because you got to make it fun, right? And then the second part of nourish is what are the things we want to keep out? Because, I mean, as you said, for many of us, the reality is that try as we might with our busy schedules, we're not necessarily able to home cook every single thing from scratch, right? And I mean, I love going to Trader Joe's and get my packaged stuff. But here's the thing, if we learn how to read food labels like a gut hero, even the foods that seem, quote, healthy, even let's say like that multi-grain, whole seed, whole grain bread that you think, oh, this is high fiber, this is great. All right. It may not necessarily be what we consider as an ultra processed food, but if we flip over and see, oh my gosh, each slice of bread has a teaspoon of sugar, 4 grams of sugar in it. And wow, I didn't realize that there were these emulsifiers in the label, right? If we can do that ourselves and also teach our kids and teenagers to do that, they will be set for life because once they go off to college, once they're living in their own apartments after college and working on their own, making their own food choices, chances are they're going to be buying some packaged foods to help stock the fridge and the pantry. So if they learn how to do that in a way that can fill their pantry with foods that nourishes their microbiome, that's going to keep them healthier for the long run. So I give very concrete tips on how to do that. Not just like, okay, read the label, but all right, well, here are the words to look for. Once you do it a few times, it'll click. And then you don't have to memorize it. You'll just be able to know by sight what's okay and what you put back right away.
Well, the chemicals and the additives and the things that you went through in the book that parents should be looking at and kids should be looking at on labels are chemicals that are relatively new in our food supply. And I think parents are going to kind of feel like how you felt 20 years ago when you thought, well, certainly we're going to change our food supply. Certainly someone's going to regulate the addition of these ingredients to foods. And you've given us the manual to do that ourselves now before somebody else does it for us.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons it's so important is because a lot of listeners to this podcast, you guys know ultra processed foods are really not good for your brains or for your immune systems. For children, there's data, research showing that a steady diet of ultra processed foods can shrink parts of the brain that are responsible for decision making, for memory and cognitive processes. We know similarly in adults, right? On the other end of the age spectrum, as we're looking at Alzheimer's and we're seeing how ultra processed foods contribute. But guess what? It doesn't just switch on those negative impacts when you're older. It happens when you're kids too. And so when we understand this, it's not enough to say, all right, don't buy the ultra processed foods. Kids have to know what is an ultra processed food. What ingredients do we look for? We have to make it really practical and we have to give the solutions. And it's not enough to, I think, do this on an individual level. When we think about what we're doing, when we're choosing to buy foods that really are better for our kids, better for our microbiomes, better for our immune and brain health, we are making a stand. We are voting with our dollars and we are telling the food makers, we're not going to stand for this anymore. Now, that ripple effect has not yet taken hold. And I think that really, if we can advocate on a broader level, whether it's going to your schools and educating your schools, a lot of the work in this book is based on a 6-week curriculum, like a little elective that I created for my daughter's 3rd and 4th grade class. It was so fun. I had poop props and probiotic little pillows and I mean, super fun. And we made things like blackberry avocado chia pudding and had poop emoji plates. And we just talked all about the 3 F's. And I mean, it's so fun. And I called it Healthy Belly, Happy You. And my goal is to get something like that into our schools because these kids, the parents were calling me saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe Johnny, like that usual rainbow colored cover thing with SpongeBob on the box that normally he would grab for, like he actually turned it over and looked at the ingredients and said, oh, mom, we shouldn't get this. This says artificial. And, artificial means fake, right? We don't want fake food, right? Or another kiddo like reading the grams of sugar and saying, oh my gosh, this has like 3 times as much sugar as I'm supposed to have in a day because we counted sugar cubes and teaspoons. And they learned that they should not have more than about 6 teaspoons of added sugar in a day. So when we empower our kids and then get that into the schools and get that into our communities, and then hopefully my wish is that then we can really impact the social inequities that occur, the socioeconomic inequities that occur, these food deserts that exist, but not only the food deserts where there's just not enough food, but they also tend to correspond and also be food swamps where not only is there enough food, nutritious food, it's also packed with these ultra processed foods. And so that's the only way we're going to really make a difference. And when parents realize that the formula and the baby food that they're trusting the FDA to regulate is full of these emulsifiers that cause gut inflammation and cause gut microbiome disruption, or is full of heavy metals and all of these other things that are above levels that really in the literature are shown to be safe, we can no longer trust that the food industry has any interest in our well-being. And sad to say, even the organic food companies, because when that congressional report came out with the heavy metals in food, there were several organic baby food manufacturers that they were found to have higher than acceptable levels of lead and cadmium and other heavy metals. So I'll get off my soapbox now because I know all the listeners are like, yes, 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 we know this, but we have to work together. This is so important.
It is. And what I'll say is a ton of docs listen to this podcast, but we have a ton of people who are just interested in health and people who are really passionate about being great parents who don't have a medical background. And then we also have a lot of doctors who listen, but they're brand new to functional medicine. So they might have been a pediatrician for 30 years, but are just starting on the path to understanding how do they help the kiddos in their practice have a resilient gut. And so I actually like that you spent some time on this topic in your book because I think a lot of folks skip over this. And you went into like, what is an ultra processed food? And I think what hit me when you explained it was that there are foods and there are ingredients that are allowed in the US that are not allowed in other countries because of the health impact. And you wouldn't know that just walking through the grocery store. And so you have to learn to read labels and some of the things you already mentioned, what to look out for, like don't buy something that says artificial. Like, can you give the parent who's listening, who isn't familiar with this, like what's the top 5 things they need to look for on a label that they should avoid for their kids? And then I also want us to give a case example because I can feel one parent in the audience being like, somebody told me I can have my kid eat healthier to help their eczema, but I don't have any faith that that would work because I've never seen it. And we've tried so many creams and pills. And so I want to talk through what to look for on the label, but then I also want to tell a story that you've seen of how these changes can actually really impact a kiddo who might have been struggling.
Yeah. I will say, even for the parent who's listening, who maybe may or not be that familiar with gut health, or new practitioners, and even seasoned practitioners. I mean, I've had seasoned pediatric functional medicine practitioners read the book, or pediatricians who are just very open-minded and reading the book, my friends, and really just come to the realization there's so much that is not being taught right now in medical school. And unfortunately, there's so much that isn't being taught for pediatric functional medicine providers. And the word really, there needs to be more training of practitioners and more awareness. And I've had, so many parents reading the book for the first time, or practitioners telling me, God, I wish I'd known this, when my kids were younger. And here's the thing, even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, as I was starting out in functional medicine, I remember even back then thinking, oh my gosh, I wish I'd known this, right? And thinking back at some of the patients I had seen. But here's the thing, but now you do, right? I mean, we can't go back and undo any of that. We can't go back, and I can't go back and undo the fact that both of my children had antibiotics when they were less than 6 weeks of age, right? It's done. It happened. I can still sit there. And of course, with the mama guilt, it still sits with you. But at the same time, we just need to congratulate ourselves that now our eyes are open. We are aware now, and really being proactive and taking the steps to either reverse any microbiome disruption that has occurred, or really now be doubly, triply committed to establishing a healthy gut microbiome. So what to look for on the label? I have a whole section that basically it's a section on how to be a gut hero food label detective. So it breaks it down into steps. But step 1, turn the package over. This is a classic example of, you definitely do not want to judge a book by its cover, right? Because food companies, whether they're organic or not, right? They are spending millions of dollars a year on marketing and consumer shopping psychology to make sure that the words, the pictures, the phrases that they're using, the placement on the package of the different graphics and writing is so that you look, so that you want. I mean, think about how many times you're attracted to, oh, it's gluten free. Let me take a closer look at that. Fine. It might make you take a closer look, but that's about it, right? You got to turn it right over. So that is the most important step. I mean, one study found that parents actually were more likely to buy a package that had graphics of smiling faces on it because it brought to mind a happy kid, right? A smiling kid, right? So we want to make sure that we're making our own decisions, that we're not having marketing psychology used on us to want to buy that. So you turn it over. And now every label has a nutrition facts panel that has the calories per serving, the servings, the grams of added sugar now must be labeled. So one of the most important things is to just jump right down and look at the grams of added sugar. And there's a whole section on sugar in the book. Added sugars, our kids are getting way more than we did historically. I mean, sugar was always, you think back to when the French pastries were invented, right? I mean, sugar has always been considered a treat, but it was always a treat. It wasn't something that was every day. And I read some statistic that 100 years ago, the average American was having maybe 2 teaspoons of added sugar a day. Now that we need a little sugar in our bread, right? We need the yeast to rise. I mean, there's purposes, right? But 2 teaspoons. The average adult now has about 19 teaspoons of sugar a day. The average teen has about 34 teaspoons of white sugar in a day. So if you lined up 34, a sugar cube is 1 teaspoon. So if you lined up 34 cubes of sugar or 34 teaspoons of sugar on a table and you said, okay, here you go. Here's your breakfast, right? You'd be like, I don't know. And yet, okay, and I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus because this was me before I actually started looking, right? So this is real life example. But you could start that if you bought like, oh, I'll have a blueberry whole grain muffin that has like 3 teaspoons or 4 teaspoons of sugar in one muffin. And then, I'm having the muffin. I would love to get a mocha frappuccino with that. And that has maybe like 6 teaspoons of sugar right there. And then, but you know what? I should have a little protein with that. So let me get the vanilla Greek yogurt that now has 5 teaspoons of added sugar. And then before you know it, you're like, wow. That right there was maybe, 20 plus teaspoons of sugar right there. And so if we don't stop and look, I have a worksheet for just doing your daily sugar inventory, right? Just normal day, just look and see. We got to know where we're starting from. But if you don't know to look, you won't realize that some foods that we have really don't think have a ton of added sugar, like your sandwich bread or your spaghetti sauce or your salad dressing, right? If we don't look, we don't realize how much is in there, right? So that's the first step. You just look. And it doesn't mean never ever. It doesn't mean that if it has a lot of added sugar, you put it back. It just means you're making an informed decision, right? If your kids really want that jasmine, lavender, boba tea, whatever thing that they're out with their friends, I just want my kids to know, all right, just take a look and see how much added sugar. I want you to understand, be informed, right? And then know, okay, if you choose to have that, then we just want to make sure that we are making different choices around our next meal or our next snack so that we can kind of help our microbiome and our brains and our immune systems to bounce right back, right? So that's one key thing that's really important for kids.
Why is sugar bad for the microbiome? You describe this beautifully and succinctly in your book, and people may not know. They may think, well, fiber is good for my probiotics, so why isn't sugar?
If you've ever brewed kombucha or beer, you know you need a little sugar in there because those microbes do love sugar. But which microbes love that sugar? It's yeast. Okay. It's yeast that loves the sugar. Just like if you've ever baked bread from scratch or bagels or homemade pretzels are super fun. But what do? You get the warm water, you put your yeast in there, your dry yeast, and then you activate it with some sugar because it needs a little sugar to kind of wake up and start multiplying. And so when we think about sugar and we eat sugar of any kind, and I'm going to say also we have to stop and remember, even things like bread, pasta, crackers, those do get converted into sugar. And so our body looks at that as sugar. And so that will directly feed the yeast in your gut microbiome. We all have yeast. A little yeast is normal. But when our yeast get fed too much and it becomes like the giant plant in Little Shop of Horrors, right? That kind of just wants like, feed me, feed me, feed me. Literally, those yeast in your child's belly or in your belly will start to tell your brain, we need more sugar. And so if your kids are addicted to sugar, you're addicted to sugar, it's likely not that you are, it's that you have a yeast dysbiosis in your gut or their gut. And literally the signals to their brain are saying, feed me, feed me, feed me. And you crave the crackers and the pasta and the ice cream and the chocolate and all of that. So that's one thing. We also know that sugar can cause gut inflammation. And in some experimental models, in animal models of the gut microbiome, it induces colitis, so intestinal inflammation. And the other thing with sugar that has to, it does have to do with the microbiome because our microbiome is so linked with our metabolic health, how we regulate blood sugar. But there's so many kids who are on the sugar roller coaster where their sugar spikes up, insulin comes and grabs the sugar and then makes their blood sugar go too low. They're on a low and they're hangry and sad and crying and angry. And then you feed them quickly. Maybe it's a little bar, a little applesauce pouch. Their blood sugar spikes up again and they're happy and they're hyper, and you kind of go up and down like that. Now, the problem with those blood sugar swings is we know that blood sugar dysregulation and insulin resistance, insulin dysregulation is an increasingly recognized underlying imbalance in virtually every chronic disease you can imagine, right? Especially in adulthood. And we know that blood sugar dysregulation reduces your body's immune system's ability to fight off infections, to recover from infections. So just even managing your blood sugar regulation alone is really important. And then you compound that with the disruption to the gut microbiome, and you have sort of this synergistic, more than double whammy to your child's immune system and to their brain.
Do you have an example of a kiddo who maybe had this problem, was on the sugar roller coaster, had some yeast overgrowth, and they made some changes, and maybe it was just with the sugar and they saw improvement?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. One example, if you're not aware, we have been in a mental health crisis for our youth for a very, very long time. Even long before the pandemic. But the pandemic has only worsened things, right? And so now, we know that by the time kids are 18, around 1 and 2 is going to have a mental health diagnosis. 1 in 3 teenage girls, has seriously thought of suicide. And it's not just our teenagers. The ER visits for self-harm and suicidality are getting younger and younger. And so when we understand that the gut microbiome drives a lot of our neurotransmitter balance, 80 to 90% of our serotonin is made in our gut, which helps us feel calm and relax and manage stress. 50% of our dopamine, which is involved in focus and attention, is made in our gut. Our gut microbiome makes over 400 times the amount of melatonin than our brain does. And so when we look at that, we can see why anything that impacts the microbiome negatively or positively can have the same effect on our children's mental health. So I'm thinking of this preteen girl who came to my office, and I'd known her family for a while. They were already living as healthily as they thought they were, right? Trying to live healthily. They were not the junk food family, right? But their daughter was a preteen and had struggles with attention and ADHD and anxiety. And anxiety was getting worse. Middle school drama is horrible, right? And I get it. And so I hadn't seen them for a while, and they came back, and she had been on multiple rounds of different medications, and they weren't helping. Right. Maybe helping just a little bit, but she still was really anxious, really flat, like unmotivated. And the parents said it was literally like walking on eggshells around her. Like the whole house is on edge, and they just want to get back to being calm and happy, right? And so I spoke with her about what factors could be impacting her mood and what was she interested in trying. And of course, diet was really hard because she was going out after school with her friends and getting Starbucks and going to boba tea and going to CVS and getting all the things, right? So I spoke about it. We discussed the gut-brain connection. When she actually, a lot of kids in school, they learn about biology and they learn about brain chemicals and serotonin. So when I told her that, look, the medication you're on right now, it's trying to help your serotonin levels work better. But guess what? If you don't have enough serotonin, because 80 to 90% of your serotonin is made by your gut bugs, it's not going to work. Right. And so when I said that, she's like, oh my gosh, even mom was like, wow. I mean, the light bulbs kind of go off on why it's so important to start with your microbiome. Right. So she understood. Did she make some of the decisions right away to change her diet? No, but she started. At least she knew, right? And then we did a stool analysis, a functional stool analysis, and found, lo and behold, she had a lot of yeast dysbiosis. I mean, several different kinds of yeast, in fact, right? And even her blood antibodies, I did check her blood, and she did have elevated Candida IgG, IgA, and IgM levels. So it's like, okay, not just in your gut, it is definitely affecting your immune system, and we know that's going to affect your brain, right? And so we talked about how to really reduce the added sugars. Now she knew, okay, yeast feed on sugar, it's really important for me to try. But we also did a yeast quote cleanse. I mean, we worked on her gut dysbiosis and we reset her gut, healed up her gut lining. And for kids, it doesn't necessarily take that long. I mean, for practitioners listening who work with adults, sometimes it's a long road. You're like, okay, 6 months later, we're slowly moving the needle. But for kids, it can be very fast. And literally, once we started the yeast cleanse, I mean, after, I want to say it was 4 or 6 weeks later, mom sent me a handwritten card and was so sweet because who writes handwritten cards anymore either? I mean, that was great, right? So she wrote me a handwritten card, which I still have in my drawer. And she said, I just want to thank you so much. The work we did with the yeast and really having Rachel understand the impact that food has on her mood. The benefits we're seeing now is nothing that any medication could have done for her. And she said she was happier for the first time. She was smiling in forever. And that she was just such a joy to be around. Like the whole family just breathed this collective sigh of relief. And I mean, it really could be as simple as that. If your child is suffering from mental health concerns or even little kids with behavioral concerns or ADHD symptoms. So even if they don't have any quote gut symptoms, right? You're like, they're not constipated, they don't have diarrhea, they don't have heartburn. Well, it's still a gut issue, right? It's still a microbiome issue. So we still look there.
I'm so glad you did. I feel like I've heard a story like the patient you've described so many times. And as responsible parents, our first thought is often like, okay, get the kid to therapy, to primary care, maybe psychiatrist. And you wouldn't stop to think, well, maybe we should check out their gut. Maybe we should see a functional medicine doctor. Maybe we should do some testing. You mentioned in your book that choosing a gut test, you have to be aware of like your kid's age and pick a company that is accustomed to providing ranges for kids. Are there some types of stool tests that you trust? Because the other thing we'll run into is some parents are going to go to their primary care and ask for a stool test and they're going to get O and P. So what should parents be looking for?
Yeah. Well, one of the resources I have in the back, and I do write a list of the basic tests that I typically run when a patient comes to the office, because for some parents, maybe they have a pediatrician who is either not familiar and not willing to order any specific tests, or maybe they have a pediatrician who is not familiar and is willing, but just is like, I don't know what to order, right? And also we have like Rupa, so many options now for consumers to be empowered to order their own tests, which is fabulous, right? But you got to know what to order, right? And so there are some baseline blood tests that I do love to order. And then when it comes to a stool analysis, it's true because what many parents don't realize is that your child's microbiome in the first 3.5 years of life, maybe even up to 5 years of life, is changing rapidly. Even in those 3.5 years, there's different stages of microbiome development. So it's not just like, oh, if you're 2 weeks old versus 3 years old, it should look the same. It's different. The younger you are, the less diversity you should have, which is really interesting because as an adult, diversity in your microbial organisms is good. When you're young, we don't want a lot of diversity. We actually want primarily bifidobacteria. And so if you do a test that is really meant for older kids, adults, and you do that test on your baby, you might think, oh my gosh, wow, they don't have enough of this lactobacillus species and they don't have enough of X, Y, and Z, but it's because it's not specifically using pediatric measures. Now, once your kids are over 4 or 5, you could use the same microbiome testing that you're using on yourself. So for listeners or for parents or practitioners who they're really used to using the Genova GI effects or doctor's data comprehensive stool analysis, I love those tests. I think they're great, right? So great, go for it. But if your kids are younger, I would suggest the only tests, and I'm going to also say as a caveat, I am a medical advisor for this company because I believe so much that we need this. There's nothing like it on the market, but it is a microbiome specific analysis for those kids who are 3.5, 4 years and younger with those different stages of microbiome development. And what Tiny Health has done is really look at signatures for risk factors. So, okay, the current state of my child's microbiome has a signature that says that they may be more at risk for developing eczema later on or ADHD later on or whatever it is. And we can intervene now. I mean, that's the perfect time to intervene is before you actually have a problem to fix, is if you can be proactive. And I was so excited to hear that Tiny Health is coming to Rupa too. So that is amazing, right? Because now these practitioner level tests that really, as a parent, you'd think, well, okay, what do I do if I don't have a functional medicine practitioner near me? It is readily available now, which is awesome.
We'll have to educate our practitioners about this together with Tiny Health. We're so excited because this is a gap in the market we've had for a while. And I'm so thrilled that they're going to be on and just to empower parents with this information because gut health is important, but what do you do for your 2-year-old? How would you find out what's going on with your gut?
That's right. And that's also a lot of parents listening. They've done the gut test for themselves. They've worked on their leaky gut. They've worked on their dysbiosis. And yet when it comes to kids and wanting to do the same thing, it's hard to know, well, are the same herbs that I took, are they okay for my kids? Or like what dosage do I use? I mean, I use glutamine at this dosage. And so that's why in the book too, I know you mentioned the resources in the back. So I have a list of different supplements and different herbs. And I give the suggested dosages that I use in my practice by age. And I wrote this for practitioners too, because a lot of practitioners starting out, they're like, it's kind of the Wild West, right? And with, I don't know, the pediatric dosage. So these are really over the past 20 years, the dosages that I've come to know to be helpful for different age ranges. And of course, it is best to work with a functional medicine practitioner and have it be truly personalized. But sometimes we need a little support while we're trying to find that practitioner.
Oh, I was so grateful you did that because I saw adults and teens. If you see any parent at all, eventually they're going to say, can I bring my kid in? I would always have to say, I can't talk to you about kids under 5. It's just not my specialty. But I love that, like, I could hand a parent this book and just know that they're so well taken care of for so many of the questions they're going to have. I even felt like so many of the questions you probably got calls about in the middle of the night, after a parent left the office, you have like written out in here and anticipated so many of the things that come up, including things like, are probiotics safe for kids to take? What do you think about sport probiotics in kids? Can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah. As a pediatrician, I want to be as evidence-based as possible. And also for parents starting out, sometimes it's one parent who's like gung-ho, fully into this functional medicine approach, and the other partner is kind of like, oh, I don't know. I want to make sure this is still evidence-based, right? I mean, that was a term that was evidence-based, follow the science. I mean, thrown around like candy, during the pandemic. But so one thing that I make absolutely clear in the book too, though, is evidence-based. When we look at the true definition of what evidence-based was supposed to mean, because when I was in medical school, the term evidence-based medicine was not around. It was a brand new, like literally just as I was leaving medical school, the academic institutions and medical organizations were trying to create this term evidence-based medicine. So it's a fairly new term, right? The definition of evidence-based medicine was really meant to be a triad. So yes, based on the latest, most available scientific research, knowing that the research lags way behind what we really need in medicine, right? But we still have to rely on that in part. So that's one leg. The second is your clinical experience as a practitioner. So a seasoned practitioner who's been doing this for 20, 30 years and they're getting successes, I want to know what they're doing because that is clinical evidence that that something is working, right? And number three, also taking into account your patients, your families, cultural values and traditions. I mean, it has to be really all combined. And so I do have tons of citations. In fact, there were so many citations that the publisher said, oh my gosh, this is going to make the book way too long. So the citations are, there's a QR code to go to get a PDF of all the like 500 plus citations. But yet I also wanted to share the evidence from my clinical standpoint, just everything that I've been doing over the past 20 years so that like literally, like you said, if a parent called me in the middle of the night, this is exactly the words you would hear from me. This is exactly what I would do for you if you came into my office for a consultation for your child's ADHD, or you called me at 2 a.m. because your child was vomiting, right? I would say, all right, do X, Y, and Z, and this is how you proceed.
Brilliant. Oh my God. I'm so glad we're having this conversation. There's so many things that I could say right now. The other thing I want to add to that is a couple things. One, I think we don't ask enough who pays for the evidence, because that's also part of this triad, right? Is if you cannot patent something, it's really hard to fund a study on it. And so we have a lot of really great evidence for a lot of pharmaceuticals because we've been able to pay for the very expensive trials, RCT trials for them. And one of the things that I think you discussed very eloquently in this book is the use of things like homeopathy and essential oils that we have really good evidence for understanding how they act biochemically in the body. We have some great studies on them. We may not have the same amount as we have on a pharmaceutical because you can't patent peppermint, for example, or really a homeopathic remedy per se if it's made of a purely natural substance. So I think that is a really important conversation. And I love that a lot of your clinical expertise has been developed around looking at things that are kind of can't hurt, might help remedies, like homeopathy, things that are very gentle, that come with a very low risk of side effects, and using those alongside conventional medicines or on their own to help with common things that we see, like earaches, like fever. So let's jump into that in a minute, but I want to respect the bridge between the gut and those interventions, because you do lay that bridge out so beautifully in your book. So we're going to dive into the interventions for like what happens when your kid has a fever and your earache. But why does the gut matter for those things? Why should you consider the gut first and do the healthy foundations of nutrition and movement and mindfulness as a foundation rather than just go straight to the homeopathy or essential oils?
Yeah. Well, as we mentioned, the gut microbiome really is the foundation for your child's immune system. And so 80% of your child's immune system is in their gut. There's also been some really great studies looking at the use of specific probiotic strains that have been proven to reduce the rates of colds and flus in the wintertime in kids, reduce fevers, reduce missed days of school in children. And so we see how powerful the right bugs in your belly, right? The right probiotics can have. And with these 5 things, right, the 5 things that really nurture your microbiome, it's interesting too, because each of those, they nourish your microbiome. And I think in so doing, they optimize your immune health. But we can see what's another thing: sleep. We know that sleep deprivation, anything less in adults than 7 hours of sleep, is going to harm your body's ability to fight off infections. For exercise, we know that exercise, mild to moderate exercise every day during the wintertime, I mean, even just 20 minutes a day, improves your ability to fight infections. And one of my favorite things to talk about is the vagus nerve, how we're breathing and engaging our vagus nerve every day. Well, your vagus nerve functioning is one of the best predictors of how quickly and how well you're going to recover from viral infections. And so all of these things tie together. They are truly the foundations, and they're the things that we have to return to over and over and over again when something goes wrong, when things shift, whether just acutely and temporarily or more long term. And so the foundations are still there. When I talk about resetting a leaky gut or healing gut dysbiosis, it's still, I call it the gut reset, but the RE stands for return. You have to return to the 5 things for microbiome magic, because if you don't do that, it doesn't matter how many supplements I tell you to take or how many prescription medicines I tell you to take, you are not going to get to healing faster. It will be an uphill battle, as opposed to returning to those 5 things and all of a sudden there's only a little ways to go to get back to health.
That's awesome. So it's like ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure approach.
Yes. And then the other thing that I think about, because of course it's mostly in early childhood to elementary years where our kids get sick after sick after sick, right? And oftentimes that sick after sick means antibiotic after antibiotic. And we have to be keenly aware that while antibiotics really and truly were rightfully considered one of the greatest public health inventions of the 20th century, now, in the 21st century, we have to recognize that while antibiotics can be life-saving, we are in a position where, from a public health standpoint, antibiotic resistance is set to be one of the leading causes of death by 2050 worldwide, right? And number two, on an individual level, right, on this child level in front of you, on an adult level in front of you, antibiotics are the single most important acute disruptor of the gut microbiome, like instantly disrupts your gut microbiome. And if we don't understand that and help restore your microbiome back to resilience when you do take antibiotics or your kids take antibiotics, that then we know can shift the balance, your child's future immune balance or mental health balance or metabolic balance. And we know that with each subsequent round of antibiotics, that can increase your risk for mental health concerns later in life. It can increase your child's risk for autoimmunity or eczema or any immune allergic phenomena from happening. So we want to take the benefits of antibiotics, use them judiciously, hopefully only when appropriate, and then mop up the microbiome disruption by restoring whatever leaky gut and dysbiosis has occurred.
Okay, we're going to stop it here because we're at the hour mark and we have so much more to talk about. By now, you should have learned why the microbiome is important for kiddos and how it's drastically different than the microbiome we see in adults. So we have to test it differently and treat it differently. You've also learned why you should think about the microbiome first and the foods your kids are eating before you start to reach for the homeopathy, the acupressure, the mindfulness, all the sort of quick fixes that we are going to go through in part 2. You really have to have the foundation of the gut first. In our next episode, which is part 2, we're going to talk about the practical, tactical, what do you do for the common childhood ailments? Everything from a stomach ache to feeling anxious to having allergies, eczema. We're going to go through some examples of what Dr. Elisa does that so successfully helps her kiddos heal quickly and without side effects. Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.